Kitchen, who is chair of our Budget and Finance Committee and is also the appointed Charter Liaison Representative for Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools. Mr. Chris Henson, Chief Financial Officer. There's Chris over here. Dr. Alan Coverstone, who is Executive Officer for Innovation. One of his responsibilities is managing the charter approval process. And Chuck Cagle, our Legal and Technical Advisor, is here. And Hank Clay, who is Legislative Liaison, is here with us today. I'd like to begin by, and I promise that we are not all making presentations, so don't worry. We will have a fairly succinct formal presentation, then hopefully an opportunity to discuss and to have questions and answers with you. I want to just do an introduction, and I would like to do this. This is to set context and to be a little bit personal with it in setting context for our presentation today. I became superintendent in Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools in January of 2009, and at that time, and at the time that I decided to apply for the job, to come back out of retirement to get into the director's position again, I looked at the context in which I was applying. At that time, we had 4 charter schools in our district. For operating charter schools, a budget of $9.7 million annually. And my analysis at that time was this. Basically, I'll make 3 points. One was the expectation that the number of charter schools and the presence of charter schools in Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools would increase, with an expectation of growth. I did an analysis and looked at the state laws that were existing at the time and saw in Tennessee state laws that were permissive and that would promote that growth here in Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools. And when I looked at local opinions, the support of Mayor Dean, support of the charter schools by Mayor Dean and other political and community leaders in our district was recognized and an expectation. So when I came, I made a decision early on, and one of the really good decisions I made, I will take credit for this fully, is to hire the first Board of Education member I've ever hired. I've been a superintendent almost 30 years, and I made a decision to hire Dr. Alan Coverstone, who was Mr. Coverstone at the time, to be Executive Officer for Innovation, to essentially develop and manage the charter school approval process for us, and that's been a very good decision. And he's knowledgeable, and at the time I thought one of the most knowledgeable people in the state about charter schools and the process, and also an advocate for constructively adding charter schools to school districts in Tennessee. This year we have 18 charter schools that are in operation in our district. Our annual budget for charter school operation is $39.5 million. Next year we will add 3. We will have 22 charter schools in operation in our district for an annual operating budget of $54.2 million in our district. Since 2009, when I came on, laws have significantly changed. Many of the restrictions that have been placed on charter schools by the state have been removed. There are no barriers now, or very few barriers compared to 2009, and the expectation is continued and increased growth. Therefore, and the point I want to make in setting the context is this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Pinkston. The responsibility on local boards of education has dramatically increased since 2009. In Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools, our process has been identified as a national model for approval of charter school process. We're considered a model. And our policy and procedures are sophisticated. The processes that have been developed over the years are very good, and we feel like we have a sophisticated, thoughtful process that allows us to choose schools that add value to public education in Davidson County. And that's the position from which we come. This time I'd like to recognize Mr. Pinkston, who will get into more details on the presentation. Thank you again very much for having us here today.
Thank you, Dr. Register, and thank you, Chairman Ralston, members of the State Board, for allowing us to come talk to you today to discuss our new policy for strategically deploying charter schools during the upcoming application cycle, and also our fiscal situation, which we believe the two are linked pretty closely, along with everything else that we do in Metro Nashville Public Schools. As Dr. Register said, I am the chairman of the board's Budget and Finance Committee. I'm also the board's delegate to the charter review process, which, as Dr. Register noted, we believe is one of the best in the state and in the country. We will not take much of your time today. I just want to share with you some information about the school system, the budget, and operational pressures that we're dealing with right now, provide some supporting documentation, which you have in front of you, and answer any questions you might have about where Metro Nashville Public Schools has been, where we are, and where we're going relative to charter schools. To help frame the conversation, we put together a brief PowerPoint presentation. I promise you that it's just 12 slides. It's not, as one of my colleagues says, a soul-crushing PowerPoint, and then we'll save time for questions should you have any. So kicking off here, I just want to give you a snapshot of our overall budget in Metro Nashville Public Schools. What we see on this slide is annual average growth of about 3 function is show me where in Nashville are these underutilized buildings. And we define exceedingly underutilized buildings as buildings that are under 70% capacity. And what you see on the map is all of the underutilized buildings. They're all in North Nashville and East Nashville. The ones that are underutilized are in blue. They're actually a lot more. And then I asked, just out of curiosity, show me the same map, but add to it the charter schools that have been approved over the last few years. And what came back was this. So the charter schools are in the red, the underutilized buildings are in the blue. And what you can see clearly is happening there, these 12 underutilized buildings in blue have been surrounded by 16 charter schools, soon to be 19 after last year's round of approvals. There are obviously any number of different reasons why any given building might be under capacity. Some schools on that map are more affected by charter proliferation than others. Overall demographic shifts are certainly part of the reason why you've got underutilized buildings, but I would submit that it's no coincidence these underutilized buildings have basically been encircled by charter schools, some approved by the local board, at least one approved or remanded back to us from the state board. And the bottom line is we've kind of reached a decision point as a school system and as a community, and the question that is in front of us is how many more new schools of any kind do we need or are we able to sustain fiscally and operationally in certain parts of town. And I would add that these particular schools, even if we approve no more charter schools over the next 5 years, those schools on that map are going to add something like 5,000 seats under their current charter agreements. So they've got plenty of room to grow without continuing to add new schools up there and out there. So in talking to a constituent of mine the other day, I used the analogy of a restaurant chain. If we are operating a chain of McDonald's and along comes Burger King to build 2 stores for every one of ours, we are dividing up the customer base, and I think that's what some people wanted to happen. But it also doesn't take an MBA to figure out that what's happening on that map is not fiscally or operationally sustainable. In fact, some charter leaders are telling us privately that they're worried about continued unabated growth in those parts of town and how it could affect the stability of their own schools. They can't say anything openly for fear of reprisals by others in the charter movement, but there is conversation going even amongst themselves. One more fiscal challenge I'll point out, in addition to charters consuming all available new revenue, there are hidden costs that we haven't begun to acknowledge, and we've only now starting to get our arms around. So, for example, Metro government is still paying debt service on some of these undercapacity buildings, and in that case, I used the restaurant analogy earlier. Now I'm going to use another analogy. It's kind of like moving out of a house before you've even finished paying off the mortgage, and then you're buying 2 new houses to replace the first. It's not a sustainable situation. So the bottom line is this. MNPS is going to manage through the fiscal and operational challenges that we face in the upcoming budget. We're committed to doing that. But we have got to be smarter about the future for 2015-16 school year and beyond. So in addition to developing a more fiscally sustainable approach, we think we've got a real opportunity to consider a more strategic deployment of charters that better meets the needs of the district as a whole. For us, it's about 7 priorities and achieving the right balance. The other piece of documentation that you have in front of you is a resolution that was passed in November by the school board, setting some priorities for how we strategically deploy charters going forward. And for the upcoming application cycle, we're really focusing on 2 big priorities. The first one is conversion of low-performing schools, and the second one is growth management. We have some areas I'll talk about in a minute where we literally cannot build schools fast enough, and we think that charters can help us add capacity in those areas. Additionally, in that policy, it's not reflected on this slide, but we built in some common sense exceptions to these new rules. For example, if an existing charter middle school wants to open a high school to create extended educational pathways for those students and families, then we may want to accommodate that regardless of where the school is located. We don't want to interrupt any student's career path. So exceptions aside, let me explain our thinking on those 2 big priorities, then we'll pause and take any questions. So conversion, rethinking our approach to low-performing schools in this district offers a good opportunity for us to deploy charters in a fiscally sustainable way. The seats are there, the buildings are there, the infrastructure exists in those situations where Metro Nashville Public Schools has not been able to solve the problem. The board is essentially ready to invite in reinforcements in the form of charter operators. We will make conversion determinations based on 3-year composite ratings on our academic performance framework, which lets us evaluate every school in the system using multiple measures. And essentially, if a school has been in the lowest performing target status, as we call it, for 3 consecutive years, it would be eligible for conversion. In my view, as budget chair, the conversion gives qualified operators the opportunity to really prove themselves if they submit a quality proposal. And I think it's also, it's a more challenging opportunity to take reform to scale. I think, one of the things that is happening now is charter operators, want us to essentially turn our back. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them want us to turn our back on low-performing schools. And frankly, that's the easy part, is going and creating new stuff. The harder part, the more courageous part, in our opinion, is stepping up to turn around something that needs help and kids that need help. If a qualified charter operator is willing to take on the challenge, we think we should embrace it. The market is already responding favorably to this conversion challenge that we've issued. We have received in this application cycle 2 conversion proposals from established operators, and we're in the process of evaluating them, and think that we're headed in the right direction there. Meanwhile, the second priority is growth management. There are some areas of Davidson County, like I said, in which we literally cannot build schools fast enough, and in those situations, the board is willing to waive in charters to help us manage extreme capacity crunches. So we talked earlier about exceedingly underutilized buildings, being those less than 70% capacity. We have at the opposite end of the county, exceedingly overutilized or overcapacity buildings that are in excess of 120% capacity. So we've got some serious operational issues to deal with. Now in South Nashville, you see that blue block on that slide. South Nashville, which is the area of town that I represent, and actually the area of town where I grew up, there are a handful of elementary schools that by fall 2017, if we don't do anything, will be anywhere from 126% to 159% capacity. That kind of extreme overcrowding is obviously unacceptable for teaching and learning, and we think charters can be useful tools for helping us manage that growth. These also happen to be in areas where there are very significant academic needs, including opportunities to help provide enhanced services to the highest concentration of English language learners in our state. Nashville has, as you may know, 8% of the public school students in the state, maybe 9% by now, but we have 29% of the English language learners. We are the most diverse school system in the state, and one of the most diverse school systems in America, and those 2 clusters that we've identified for growth management are the most diverse clusters in our state. I've got an elementary school in my district called Glenview, which is one of these overcrowded schools. It is the smallest school zone in the city. It's a mile wide. Every kid walks. The reason it's so small is because it's surrounded by apartment complexes that have become settlement points for new Americans. We have 800 kids in that school, soon, and it's already over capacity. 40% of them speak Arabic, 40% speak Spanish, 20% speak something else, which may or may not be English. We believe that charter operators can help us innovate around English language learner strategies, and if we can crack the code with innovation in that area, we think we've helped the system as a whole. So I think, in my view, bold charter operators should jump at a chance to help us pioneer those innovations for our EL populations, and they are. And we've gotten a couple of good applications, we think, that are going to be viable, and we look forward to putting that growth management opportunity to work. Unfortunately, we have got at least one charter applicant right now, a school called Strive, which comes to us from the Tennessee Charter School Center, that seems intent on disregarding the board policy, and they are declining to help us manage growth in our new American population. We believe this operator may eventually come to the state board to appeal, even though we have already on 2 different occasions extended the hand of partnership, explained our budget and operational pressures, and encouraged the school to rethink their approach. And each time this particular applicant disregarded our budget pressures and said they were intent on ignoring the district's stated needs. So frankly, we would like to avoid another Great Heart situation and avoid another multi-million-dollar fine that drains our fund balance and reduces resources in the classroom. So that's why we wanted to come today and explain the new strategy and the rationale behind it. Last slide. As I said earlier, we have, Dr. Register said we have one of the strongest charter review processes in the country. Dr. Alan Coverstone has developed a process that has a great deal of rigor and integrity. His team and ultimately the school board have a discerning eye for quality, which is one of the reasons our charter schools tend to outperform others in the state. And with the board's input and feedback, the charter review process now utilizes these 3 primary lenses that you see on the slide. First and foremost, it's quality. All applications have to meet quality standards developed by the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. That's a must. Second, these applications should address one of the board's stated priorities, conversion or growth management. And again, growth management is in areas with significant opportunities to close achievement gaps. And then the third is fiscal impact. Excuse me. So in an environment in which charter growth is consuming every dime of available new revenue, we just got to be more fiscally balanced in our approach. And under no circumstances are we comfortable continuing to feed 5% of the system at the expense of the other 95%. So staying on the current fiscal path is unsustainable, and we believe, as state law suggests, contrary to the best interests of the pupils, school district, and community. So, summing up, we view charters as key components in our school improvement strategy, but the reality is we have reached a tipping point that's required a lot of tough conversations. We are, and we will continue to approve charters, but we are adapting our approach so that we can do it in a way that's in the best interest of the district as a whole. So rather than leave any future appeal to chance, we wanted to come and brief you on what we're doing and why, and just be proactive and reach out. So with that, I know Dr. Register and I and our other members of the team are happy to take any questions you have or have any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Comments? Carol?
Just as a point of information, I didn't see any of the materials, the number of students that are actually enrolled in the charters, and by what grade level those students are.
Our charter enrollment in, Dr. Coverstone, correct me if I'm wrong, our charter enrollment in 2014-15 is projected to be 8,600? 5,900, excuse me. All right, so I do need help. So 5,900, which is about 6 or 7% of the population? Okay. And those are predominantly middle school seats. Some of them are elementary seats. There will be 2 new high schools coming online in that school year.
But right now, are there no high school charters?
Actually, we've got 2. Okay. Alan, you want to come? Dr. Register as well? Any other questions?
So the response on the question is Lead Academy, one high school, and then one coming online that will be growing into high school next year.
High school, and we have 3 other high schools approved.
So it's a much smaller number of elementary, the early grades.
Correct, although a couple years ago we had a priority for elementary schools and added a couple of elementary schools. One of those is at K through 2 now, another is at K1, and then one is at kindergarten this year. So those are growing into elementary capacity, 2 or 3 others.
I probably should know this, but I don't. But what is the amount of money that follows the student when they enroll in a charter from your district?
Our
per student.
Our per pupil expenditure, state and local, will in 2014-15 be $9,200 projected. And the way to think about that is if you have a charter school open in a particular neighborhood and it pulls 10 kids from one school, 10 kids from another school, 10 kids from elsewhere, inside those traditional school buildings, when 10 kids go out the door, at $9,200 per pupil in terms of the cash outlay, a little less than $100,000 goes behind them. But in the short term, we're not then immediately able to change staffing patterns, turn off a yellow bus, reduce debt service, stop mowing the grass, reduce utilities. So in the short term, there are some significant fixed costs that we're dealing with.
Other questions?
What is your average class size in middle school?
I'm sorry?
What is your average class size in middle school?
Less than the state required by 1 or 2 students, mid-20s, low 20s. We make quite a commitment in the district to keep class size down, particularly in our low-performing schools and schools that were affected by our zoning plan.
Mike?
Have you all done any economic modeling on introducing vouchers into the matrix?
No, we have not. Chris? I mean, if we're in the financial questions, I need to get Chris up here.
We have not.
I heard that. Thank you, Chris. seem to me that a potential charter operator would want to follow your strategic priorities. You know, that would be where they would want to place a charter school system with that. Why do you find that you've got some that don't want to do that, don't want to go elsewhere?
It would seem to us that way as well, and we were optimistic that the charter movement would react favorably, and by and large it has. We had, for example, KIP, which operates a high-performing charter school not too far from here, does not do historically conversions, but they, working with their national partners, have actually been rethinking their approach based on the conversations that we've had with them and that they've had in other similar conversations in other districts. So I want to be clear, some operators are being very responsive, but we have a couple that are recalcitrant, is the only polite word I know for it, and they are coming to us from an organization called the Tennessee Charter School Center, which has basically decided that it and the schools that are affiliated with it are going to challenge the district and be hostile at every turn. So it's getting into an ideological space, unfortunately, rather than something that's reasonable and rational.
Just a question, Will, as it relates to kind of the conversion model, are you looking at a whole school conversion, or because I know some charters do a phased-in approach? Have you guys considered that, or where are you on it?
The conversions that we've made have been grade level at the time. That's worked fairly well in some circumstances, and in others, frankly, I have concerns about that, so I think that remains to be seen. We would consider the applications and look at conversion or whole school, grade level at the time, or whole school conversion, depending on the application.
Each application. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay.
Thank you very much for hearing us today.
Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the board.
Okay, we'll now move to the administrator evaluation process. Sarah, do you have that?
I sure do. I'm going to invite Paul Fleming to join me as well. We're going to tag team this, if that's all right with you. I think we have some slides. Those up. While those are coming up, good afternoon. It's good to see everyone. And just by way of introduction of this topic, we've talked to you at past meetings and at past workshops about the revisions that we're making to the administrator evaluation in Tennessee. So we wanted to come to you today with an update on that work. We are feeling good about where we are now in the process and are preparing for summer training and rollout in the 14-15 school year. So I want to give you some information about that. And then at the end of that conversation, I also want to give you a brief update on where we are with leader preparation, an interim review process that I know has been a question that some of you have had. So with that, we'll jump right in, and feel free to stop me if you have questions as we go. I wanted to start by, again, reminding us around the reason for administrator evaluation. Like teacher evaluation, it really is about delivering high-quality feedback. We've seen over the last few years in Tennessee that the power of feedback to improve instructional practice and then to improve student outcomes is a real factor in improving our student achievement across the state. And so we think it's really important to look at administrator evaluation specifically and ensure that we have instruments and processes that are really facilitating the delivery of high-quality feedback to all of our school leaders. And as you can see in the continuum, we really think that the deeper skills and the practices that come from that high-quality feedback have the power to increase student learning across the state. Bit of history and just kind of quick review, because we have made some changes to principal evaluation in the past. All of this really began under the First of the Top Act that was passed in January 2010, because that spoke to the need to create new principal and teacher evaluation systems across the state. That means that we're in our third year currently of implementing both teacher and principal evaluation. And so we've had a principal model that's been implemented across the state. This is now just our attempt to build a model that's more reflective of the work that principals are being asked to do with some of the new initiatives and the new work that has come online in the last few years. We revised, as you may remember, the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards back in 2013, and that was the first step in making the change around instructional leadership expectations to better reflect the changing nature of the principal's work, and specifically to focus on the instructional expertise and the teacher development that we believe our principals need to be providing in order that our teachers are supported in a way that, again, leads to better student results. So from that revision back in 2013 and the new instructional leadership standards that you approved, we have begun to pilot this current year a revised rubric that takes those standards and puts them into a rubric that we think will better facilitate, again, the kind of feedback that our principals need. And as I mentioned before, we're planning full implementation for this coming school year in 2014-15. I want to pause there for just a minute because as we've thought about this work, we knew we had to increase our capacity at the State Department. And so in addition to Paul Fleming, we've also been fortunate enough to hire Penny Thurman, I believe is here in the front row, if you can just stand or wave your hand. And Penny comes to us from Lauderdale County. She's a former elementary school principal, very successful in that job, which is one of the reasons that we selected her for this role. But she and Paul together have been traveling the state over the last 6 to 9 months, essentially, working with both our pilot districts, and Paul will speak to this in just a minute, but also with people who have not been in the pilot to make sure that across the state there's a real awareness of the changes that are being made and that we're really preparing our principals and our superintendents and our supervisors for the rollout in 14-15. So just wanted to let you be introduced to her because she's been a leading face and force in this work.
And a loss for Lauderdale, but a gain for the state because we were fortunate. She was in a school that was really struggling and turned it around in about 3 years to go from a level 1 to a level 5 school in a really high poverty district. So we were very excited to get her on board for the state.
Absolutely. So I'm going to turn to Paul here in just a minute to talk about the specific rubric that we've piloted and the changes that we've made. But before I do that, just again, a reminder, the top policy that already exists around evaluation actually already speaks to the basic structure for principal evaluation. So what we're presenting to you today is really about the rubric itself, which is not something, it's not a document that lives in policy. So there's not actually any action items that you will need to vote on tomorrow to make these changes, but the rubric and the changes that have been made are significant enough that we want to make sure that the board feels really comfortable and is aware of the shifts that have been made in that tool. So I'm going to turn it over to Paul to talk about the specifics of the rubric.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And you have a draft of that pilot rubric in front of you. And as Sarah mentioned, they're not specific action items, but we wanted to give you a sense of where we've been and what's been happening this year with our pilot folks, and then also where we're going with the proposed rollout statewide 2014-15. And this rubric, again, that is in front of you as a copy, is based on a lot of strong national research around instructional leadership and activities specifically and actions that leaders take to propel student achievement. And that's a real strong research base. It is aligned to the 4 TILS standards from the revision of the TILS in 2013. Also, a big win so far from the pilot districts is we started with 22 indicators. We're now down to 17, so that reduction that you see there in front of you is a direct reflection of the feedback we'll talk about in a moment from the pilot districts as well. Multiple descriptors and the specificity around each indicator. And what our pilot folks this year really love so far is on that far right column of the rubric. For every indicator, there are specific examples of evidence around outcomes and process and practices that folks have really liked seeing those for examples that they can use with their principals and give them like a real hands-on, what does that really look like when we're talking about working with principals in the evaluation process. We've also included a glossary because we want to make sure that we don't throw out a term that everyone has a different understanding, and that can happen when you're talking about some pretty specific things like building capacity for shared leadership that's on there. So we have that. This is just a quick overview of our 10 districts that piloted this year, and we feel good we have a pretty good mix of small, medium, and large districts. About 245 schools total, and about 13% of all schools in Tennessee that we're piloting this year. And this was, again, really helpful to see how this was implemented in large districts like Metro Nashville and Jackson-Madison, but then also in some of our smaller districts from the west to the east as we're seeing. And that is helpful. And in fact, that led us as well. This was our advisory council that just met officially for the last time. We've pulled them from directors of schools, from organizations like TOSS with Wayne Miller. We have Dr. Sharon Roberts here. I want to make sure people know is here from SCORE that served on this advisory council. Supervisors like Angela Rowan. I don't know if Angela is here. We'd asked her to come and be introduced as well from the pilots, but then also folks outside the pilot, like from University of Tennessee at Knoxville, as well on the higher ed side, to really form a real complete picture of what kind of feedback they would provide to us this year. And so on a monthly basis, they did that. And Sharon, not to put you on the spot, but just quickly, if there was any thoughts you had from that process and being part of the advisory council, especially serving in your role, which is pretty unique as well.
Well, happy to share with the board.
Come to the microphone.
Yeah, can you come up?
Make public comment, please.
Thought it would be helpful to hear as well from the advisory council and individuals that were part for this.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just happy to share with everyone that it was a very enjoyable process and a very thorough process. We had representatives on the council that were both implementing the revised rubric and the process, as well as people who weren't. And a very engaged process. Paul and Sarah did a wonderful job leading that. Each member of the committee also had the opportunity to go within their own networks and share and get input. So I feel like it was a very thorough process that we very much appreciated. Got into some really strong conversations about the content of the rubric and process and training coming up and those kinds of things. So commend the 10 districts for their participation because it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And just grateful for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And also the advisory council members, because they were Sharon mentioned, very intentional about taking this back, and we did different rounds of feedback. So they would go back to their districts, they would talk to their stakeholders, and then come back on that monthly basis. And that was really a helpful process for us, especially around the content of the rubric, the process, and then the support tools. So those three areas that you see on the slide were very effective, and that's why when we're standing in front of you today, it's with some of those pieces of key feedback that were coming from the advisory council as well. And that was helpful with that. So leads to some of this key feedback that you have a specific sheet. Sarah's going to just talk briefly on the overarching pieces, and then you have a one page in front of you that are pretty specific about some of the key pieces of feedback that the pilot district and the advisory council would like to see going forward.
Yep, and again, just at a high level, and Paul mentioned this before, but one of the key bits of feedback that we received from the advisory council and from our pilot participants was that it was a really good rubric. It represented the right changes in practice that principals need to be making to support teachers in instructional development, but it was pretty comprehensive and it was a little longer than it needed to be. And we kind of had that feeling going in. We knew it was pretty comprehensive. The role of the principal is a big one, as we know. But it was really helpful to have that feedback as we tried to cull the indicators and get it down to a tighter, leaner rubric so that we could really implement it with fidelity and that folks could feel like there was a tight focus on instructional leadership. So as Paul indicated, and you'll see this in the one pager a little bit more specifically, we reduced the number of indicators from 22 to 17 as a result of that feedback. So that was one of the biggest changes that we made that I think, again, positions us to be in a better place moving forward for statewide implementation with the rubric. The other key bit of feedback that we received was around the weighting. And as you know, or may remember, there's two observations that are conducted each year for principal. One is in the first semester and one is in the second semester. And that involves a site visit where the superintendent or the supervisor is going out to school and observing various activities and practices. And the advisory council felt strongly, and our pilot participants, that we should weight those observations a bit differently to encourage and emphasize the growth over the course of the school year. So our recommendation is to use 1/3 for the first observation and 2/3 for the second in terms of a differential weighting.
And just to add to that, on your one pager, some of the districts were also asking for that option, and especially, I think, again, of Sharon's work with the Tiger districts, the 12 districts that are using the Tiger teacher model, are very interested in using this model, the team model, for principal evaluation, but having the flexibility, and that's when you see that scoring flex plan, to put in feedback after that first required observation, but not a score, and then do the summative scoring at the end. So those requirements that you see on that sheet, they would be required to use the team rubric, they would be required to put in feedback in the code after the first required observation, they would be required to enter summative scores at the end of the second observation, and they would obviously need superintendent sign-off before they even went down that road for that scoring flex plan. So it's not bringing an alternate model, because they expressed interest and they believe strongly in this rubric, in the team rubric, but they wanted some flexibility around the scoring. So there would be kind of the base plan that Sarah just talked about with the 1/3 and the 2/3 on the required observations, and then they could apply for the scoring flex plan as a district, and that would have to be a district decision for them going forward. So that's there.
The third big bucket of feedback was around support tools and resources, especially throughout the school year and the first year of implementation specifically. So we've been working again to develop some optional but support resources and structures. And again, some of the one-pager speaks to that, but this will involve, and Paul, you may want to talk about a teacher perception survey, which is another way of gathering evidence from teachers about the principal's performance, and some other structures that we'll put in place to draw on the study councils that meet regionally and have those as a vehicle for supporting principals throughout the year and superintendents.
And that was feedback we heard from the pilot folks and the advisory council to say, can you put out basically like a menu of support tools that are recommended but that are not mandatory? And so we'll have on the team website and available to all districts, they'll have access to those support tools, but they won't be required or mandatory. And then that really will allow for some district flexibility too. I think that will be effective. So it may be good to stop at this point on any quick questions, because we'll go to kind of just the communication and the training would be the last part to talk to. But you have some of the specifics on that one pager as well.
Was there any sense in the LEAs that you stated that being evaluated by someone who themselves aren't evaluated?
Like a supervisor.
Or a superintendent.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, a lot of our pilot districts have been talking to us and others about that's kind of the natural next step, is what would an evaluation process look like, specifically around for supervisors, obviously not for directors, but for supervisors, so that it would be that accountability moving up to the next level. As we know right now, that doesn't exist, but we even have a couple pilot districts that have taken this rubric and made some minor changes and are using it with supervisors. If that makes sense. That's been an interesting process to see that a couple of the pilot districts, they feel that a lot of the indicators in this rubric can really apply for the next layer of evaluation.
So we'll see. We're kind of exploring that conversation because the First to the Top Act doesn't require district staff to be evaluated like teachers and principals are required to be evaluated. So it would be optional, and we, would want to let that be driven by the interest of the district. But it does seem like a question that we're getting, and like Paul mentioned, some districts are already beginning to think about what that could look like. Superintendents are another story.
Just institutional, the way things work, it's hard for anyone to be evaluated by someone who themselves, whether it's a hospital or whatever, it's whether the race to the top or what requires it. I think it's something we ought to think about.
And in fact, some of our advisory council folks believe that process of developing an advisory council might be a good next step at the supervisor level to think about what would that really look like for supervisors.
We'll come back to you on that. That came up, at our last meeting on Tuesday.
That's really an editorial. I'm not asking.
Well, it's a conversation that we're having, so it's a good question.
In most cases, is the evaluator a supervisor? Is that?
Generally speaking, in smaller districts, the superintendent will do more of those, so it varies actually quite a bit. But in most districts where they have instructional supervisors, which most of them do, they're playing a role in evaluation of principals.
Can I ask a question as it relates to support tools and just the use of a teacher perception survey? Where does that fit into the rubric today, and how will we incorporate that going forward?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so right now it's right. It is offered as purely a support tool, and I think that's for the immediate future. About it's not counting, in other words, part of their observation is an X percent. But the idea that what's that?
Do we think it could be at some point?
There's always that possibility.
Yeah.
Right now, we're being clear to say it's still. I mean, we've just piloted it in the pilot process. We think it can provide some really important additional evidence to inform the qualitative kind of appraisal of the principal, but I think we'll have to take it one step at a time and see. I mean, certainly like student surveys, and there's always the potential to incorporate that at some point, but it's a little premature probably at this point on this tool, just because it's so new.
And even the pilot districts that are using the teacher perception survey will have by next week gathered and looked at a lot of the results and letting them figure out how to use them. But so far there's been a lot of strong response rate by the teachers in order to give quality feedback about the principal.
I will say, just this is again anecdotal, but like we've seen with student surveys, it's really the feedback and not even a score that is, driving changes. So I think even without counting it as X% and using it as additional evidence, we'll see that inform the conversations that are happening about principal performance.
Yeah, great question. Other
timeline.
Quickly. So on the communication plan, and this is where Penny has also said a huge role. We've kind of laughingly called it the roadshow, but we've really been intentional about going from every superintendent study council, supervisor study council, principal study council, among even core district team coaches, to talk to the non-pilot folks about what's in this rubric and what's coming. Because what we didn't want to do, and the commissioner said this before as well, is we don't want to get to this summer and then everybody realize, oh, we now have this new evaluation process or this new rubric. And so far, because of being, I think, pretty intentional about that communication, that feedback's been appreciated, I know, from the non-pilot districts and regions. And our goal by May 1st, and we're on target, is to see all those regions that you see in front of you at those different levels as well. So we've been feeling good about that process and what it looks like. And that really